Okay, we have a handle on attachment and how that really early interaction between parent and child is going to influence things throughout the life cycle. But I want to circle back and talk a little bit more about parenting styles as well. And I don't want to take a ton of time on this because some of the research results here are a little inconclusive. But I think it's important to just briefly mention how there are different parenting styles, obviously, and the fit of a style is going to depend on the child and also lead to some kind of predictable sorts of results for how children are going to generally act. So you might think about these kinds of two dimensions of the vertical, more responsive at the top to less responsive and warm on the bottom, and this axis here of low control and demandingness on the left and more demandingness and control on the right. And you can cross these things and find these uninvolved, permissive, authoritarian, and authoritative parenting styles. So this is one of many very common ways to think about parenting styles. Not the only one, but a very useful, relatively common one. Usually, people are going to recommend that you try to stick to this more authoritative parenting style, where you have clear rules, you have consistent application of them, but you're not just being like a dictator, basically, right? You are talking with your children about the types of rules, why you have them, what you want for them, and things like that. Where you lose that sort of communication with your children and are just demanding for them to do things with this authoritarian style, you might see with more authoritarian children that they're going to follow rules, but they might not be particularly independent, right? They're going to rely on that structure because you never let them, improvise on their own, basically. Authoritative children, when they kind of know the reasoning behind things, are more likely later in life to be more self-reliant and self-directed and do well at in the school environment. Um, Permissive parenting, you're indulgent and supportive, but you just kind of let them do what they want. Children that are permissive are sometimes going to be somewhat irresponsible, and it might be difficult for them to fall into, the structure of a school day or a work day later on. And uninvolved parents where they don't have much time to give their children, they might be not around all that much. Those types of children, or the children that experience that, are going to be more impulsive and maybe less able to follow rules, kind of similar to permissive children in some ways. But again, I don't want to emphasize that these things are hard and fast rules. The effectiveness and success of these different styles is going to depend a lot on the child, and it's really, really difficult to isolate different factors out of this and say with confidence that the parenting style is the only thing leading to something. So imagine, a wealthier household where only one parent works and another parent has, all their time that they have decided to commit to, being an attentive parent. It's much easier to be an authoritative and present parent when you have the time to do that. But if you have a lower SES family and both parents work and there's only so much time they can spend with their kids, there's only so much they can do in a particular day, then you might find that it's tempting to engage in one of these other three styles, either be uninvolved or, just be loving or just be someone who enforces the rules. So it's really difficult just in that very quick example to disentangle the effects of your parents' work status and your socioeconomic status from these parenting styles. So it can be difficult to tell. There needs to be a lot more research on this, and it's really difficult to look at the causal picture here. Okay, as we wrap up the development unit, I just want to talk about a few different things that we really didn't get to when we were going through, different stage models and attachment styles and stuff. I just want to mention the development of gender identity. It's important to separate biological sex from gender identity. These are not the same thing, although they do tend to be correlated, certainly. But by the time a kid is, 2 or 3 years old, even if they haven't been in like daycare or preschool, they're already starting to adopt some sort of gender identity because of the socialization that they're getting from even, their parents' actions and books that they're reading and other children that they're interacting with, and starting to understand in whatever culture they're in what fits into a female or male sort of presentation. And by elementary school, most children are pretty reliably identifying themselves as a single gender. And based on that identification, children are acting within those prescribed gender roles most of the times. So I want to emphasize that gender roles, these patterns of behavior that we fall into based on our gender identity, are different in different cultures, and they are separate from biological sex, right? There's nothing about having one particular set of genitals versus another that means that you have to have, masculine traits or feminine traits or have a certain type of job or whatever. But by the time kids are in adolescence, they're adhering very much to these different roles because they have learned them through so much communication and have these such a strong associations from media, and oftentimes how their family and friends and other loved ones might talk about and perform these things. So I'm not here to tell you that gender roles are like an inherently evil thing, but it is important to note that these roles that we fall into and prescribe for other people are socially constructed things and are, not something that should necessarily be invariant for everyone, right? It's just another aspect of culture in a lot of ways that we often perceive as being very rigid and that affect people in a relatively rigid way. Along the lines of identity, forming a personal identity is something that, of course, is going to happen as you age. This is something I talk about a lot in my social psych class. We have a whole unit on the self. But how do we know who we are as an individual? And a lot of what we think about ourselves is based on our relationships and interactions with other people. All those different experiences with what we could be and what people see us as shape who we are. And one kind of developmental way of looking at developing a personal identity comes from a researcher named Erik Erikson. And he says that we basically go through these 8 different developmental crises, basically, that as we are going through our lives, we have these almost sort of battles with being trusting or mistrusting, or being autonomous or having shame and guilt about the things we're doing, having, feeling like we're productive and industrious or feeling inferior. And you can see how these pairs of different ideas kind of fit with the types of life stage that people are in. So, when the world is basically, are people, helping me or not, then you're going to learn basic trust and mistrust. When you're a toddler and you're first starting to move around, you're going to have these ideas about independence and autonomy, and becoming ashamed of things or doubting yourself as you start to navigate the world. As you're a preschooler and you're starting to think about direction and who you are, you might be taking initiative or being guilty about the direction that you're going, or if you're not going in a direction, and on and on and on, until battles with finding a partner and being intimate or being isolated later in life, being generative in your middle age years. People talk about like a midlife crisis. If you're not generative and happy with the things that you're doing in your life, then you might feel like you're stagnating and stuck. And when you're an older adult and maybe past the age of working in a job that maybe you identified very strongly with, you might have this battle between integrity and despair that you have wasted something or not gained enough or shared enough. So I know I didn't go into tons of detail about all of these. You could have a whole lecture about these different sorts of crises that we go through, but the way you react to these crises and kind of the path you take through choosing one or the other of these directions more strongly each time is going to shape a lot about who you are as a person, according to Erickson, right? And even if this isn't, exactly right, hate to introduce another stage model here when we know that those are problematic in various ways, but these are things that overwhelmingly people do tend to grapple with over the course of their lives. So after all that being born and getting older and growing old, when you get to the end of your life, I've talked about this a little bit already, but growing old brings physical declines and challenges. And one thing that comes along with this is the idea of ageism, discriminating or having prejudice against someone based on their physical age. And this tends to be a type of prejudice that we are, sort of okay with as a culture, which doesn't make it good. And it is a more like socially acceptable type of discrimination in a lot of ways, like aging people out of jobs or thinking they're not capable of helping and things like that. Um, and people oftentimes think the elderly have dementia or sick or they're isolated and depressed. And like I mentioned earlier, these kinds of perceptions are a little bit overblown. And if you think about how we have expectations about people and we only give them the opportunities that we think are appropriate, or we only treat them the way that we think they are, that's going to lead to these sort of self-fulfilling prophecies through a process called behavioral confirmation. Again, something else I talk about in my social psych class, that if you are only, giving people easy kind of patronizing things to do when they're older, then they're not going to be able to show you that they're still vibrant and intelligent people, right? People are only going to be able to work within the bounds they're given. So this leads to these sort of self-fulfilling prophecies. But it's not true that all the changes when you grow older are negative. Some types of memory and certain specific types of intelligence, continue to increase throughout life, and a much higher proportion than people expect of elderly people report really high commitment with their lives and social interactions, and remain really engaged in their communities, and sometimes become much more engaged in their communities in their later life as they're seeking out new connections, as they're sometimes losing other ones. So just, I guess, my kind of hokey PSA about not being discriminatory in terms of age, because it's something that I think maybe is easier to do than we might expect, and has a bigger impact than we might expect. Finally, I don't have a ton to say about death and dying other than kind of our reactions to it. You probably have heard of the stages of grief and loss by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. This is a clinical psychologist that came up with these things. And the way that we deal with people in our lives dying, according to her, goes along in these predictable, again, another stage model I know I'm showing you, but we tend to have first denial or disbelief, yearning, then anger, then depression, and finally acceptance. And these things tend to come in kind of a predictable order. Although, as you can see from this, they're not something that, it's not like you have disbelief, then you're done with disbelief and you move to yearning, then you're done with yearning and you move to anger. And if you look at people's actual reactions, you look at the data, of these grief indicators, you'd find that it looks a little bit messier than that. That these things are going to acceptance is higher earlier than you might expect. But if you take these grief indicators and rescale them in a way to kind of put them all on the same sort of scale, because this y-axis is a little misleading because people are engaging in social desirability, wanting to say things about acceptance earlier. If you scale these things in the same way, sorry, I had this in a funny order, then you find that scale them all on the same 0 to 1 sort of scale, then you do actually find the order that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross hypothesized. So you start with disbelief, then yearning is going to peak, then anger, then depression, and then acceptance will rise over time. So this is another one of those examples where, on average, this kind of hypothesis does seem to be correct, that these things are going to go in this order, even though it might not be exactly like that for every single person. But there is something to this sort of order of stages if you take the mean across lots of different people. Okay, I'm going to wrap up there.